Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was just another quiet night at the old diner. The kind of place you'd expect to find a trucker or a weary traveler grabbing a midnight meal. The neon sign outside flickered intermittently, casting an eerie glow across the empty highway. Inside, the hum of the fridge and the sizzle from the grill were the only sounds, but even those felt out of place in the oppressive stillness. That's when she walked in. Her name was Sarah, a college student on a road trip. She had been driving for hours, feeling the fatigue of the open road creep into her bones. When she pulled into the parking lot, there were only a couple of cars, not many people this late. Sarah figured she'd grab a quick coffee, stretch her legs, and continue on her way. The waitress, an older woman with a tired face, gave her a warm smile as she walked in. "We don't get many customers this late," she said, motioning to a booth in the corner. "Sit anywhere you like." Sarah nodded and slid into the booth, the vinyl squeaking under her weight. The menu was worn, edges frayed and stained from years of use. She ordered a coffee, the kind of black, no-frills brew that seemed fitting for the place. The waitress poured it for her, and as Sarah took her first sip, she couldn't help but notice the odd smell lingering in the air, something like rotting meat mixed with old cleaning chemicals. She tried to shake it off, but it seemed to cling to the walls, suffocating the room. As Sarah sat there, she noticed a man at the far end of the diner. He was hunched over his food, eating slowly and methodically, as though every bite took effort. His hands trembled slightly, and his face was pale, too pale, almost sickly. His eyes were glued to his plate, but every few seconds he would glance up, staring at her for a moment before quickly looking away. At first, Sarah thought it was just her nerves playing tricks on her. It had been a long drive, and she was tired. She tried to ignore him, focusing instead on her coffee. But then it happened again. The man's eyes flicked up, staring at her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. Her pulse quickened. The waitress seemed oblivious to the man, moving around the diner as if everything was normal. Sarah tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger. The man was staring again, and this time his gaze didn't waver. She could feel his eyes boring into her from across the room. Without thinking, Sarah stood up and headed to the bathroom, hoping the brief break would calm her nerves. As she passed the man's table, she caught a glimpse of his food. It was a strange, grayish mass that didn't look like anything she recognized. It had an unsettling, almost fleshy texture. She quickly turned away and hurried to the bathroom, her heart pounding in her chest. The bathroom was just as old and decrepit as the rest of the diner, the flickering fluorescent lights casting an unsteady glow across the dirty tile floor. Sarah locked herself in a stall and tried to collect her thoughts. It wasn't until she heard the bathroom door open that she started to panic. There was no way anyone else could be here. She was the only one in the diner, aside from the man and the waitress. She stayed silent, holding her breath as she listened to the footsteps approach. The sound of shuffling came closer, closer, until it stopped just outside her stall. The door creaked open slowly. Sarah didn't move. She was frozen, too terrified to make a sound. Then she heard it, a low, rasping whisper. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said. It was hoarse and strained, as though the person speaking hadn't used their voice in years. Before Sarah could respond, the door slammed shut, and she heard hurried footsteps retreating down the hallway. She stayed in the stall for what felt like an eternity before finally gathering the courage to leave. When she stepped out, the diner was empty. The man was gone. The waitress, too, had vanished, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the low murmur of the wind outside. Sarah bolted for the door, heart racing. As she stepped outside, she glanced up at the diner's neon sign. It flickered one last time before going dark. She never saw that diner again. The next morning, she drove past the spot where she remembered it being. But there was nothing there, just an empty field with a faded for sale sign half buried in the dirt. The only thing left of that place were the memories and the strange feeling that perhaps the diner had never really been there at all.
Story number 2.
It was a stormy night when Dan pulled into the Hollow Pines diner. The rain had been hammering the windshield for hours, and the forest-lined road seemed to stretch on endlessly. The diner's glowing sign appeared out of the mist like a beacon. Just the word diner in blocky red letters, blinking in and out like a heartbeat. It looked out of place, tucked in the middle of nowhere with no cars in the lot. But Dan was starving, and this was the first sign of civilization in over 60 miles. The moment he stepped inside, a thick wave of warm air and the scent of greasy food enveloped him. The place was dimly lit, almost sepia-toned, with faded wallpaper, rusted ceiling fans, and cracked leather booths. It looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. Oddly, though, there was no music, no chatter, no background noise, just silence. Behind the counter stood a tall, rail-thin man in a dirty white apron. His skin looked almost waxy, his eyes sunken and dull, but he smiled as Dan entered. "Take a seat anywhere," he said, voice hollow. Dan hesitated, then chose a booth by the window, though the storm outside had swallowed the view in blackness. There were no menus. The man just walked over and asked, "Will it be the special?" Something about the question made Dan pause. What's the special?" he asked. The man just smiled wider and said, "The kind of meal you don't forget." Uneasy but too hungry to argue, Dan nodded. The man shuffled back behind the counter and disappeared into the kitchen without another word. As Dan waited, he glanced around the diner. That's when he noticed the photos. Lining the walls were dozens of black and white photographs. Each one featured a different person, seated in the exact booth Dan was sitting in. Men, women, young, old, but all of them had the same expression. Wide-eyed, mouth slightly open, as if they were caught in the middle of a scream. Something about their eyes, it was like they were still alive, trapped behind the glass. Dan got up and walked to the nearest photo, heart thudding. The photo looked recent, despite being black and white. The person in it wore a shirt that looked eerily similar to what he had on. That couldn't be a coincidence. Just then, he heard a strange scraping sound from the kitchen, like metal dragging across tile, and a low, gurgling growl. The air shifted, and suddenly the warm, greasy comfort of the diner soured into something rancid. He turned back to the counter and saw that the tall man was back, holding a steaming plate. Dan sat back down out of instinct, and the plate was placed in front of him. The food looked unidentifiable, pale, fleshy slabs in a dark red sauce. It smelled metallic, almost like blood. He looked up to say something, to protest, but the man was already gone. When he stood to leave, the lights flickered, and the exit sign above the door went dark. The door wouldn't budge. He pushed harder. It didn't move. Panic rising, he banged on the glass, but outside was nothing but blackness. No road, no storm, no trees, just a thick void pressing against the windows. From behind him came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. He turned and saw the figures from the photographs. They were stepping out of the walls, colorless, their eyes locked on him. They moved in silence, except for the sound of flesh dragging on linoleum. Dan backed away, slipping and falling to the floor. The photo above the booth now showed his own face. His mouth was open in a scream he didn't remember making, eyes wide with horror. The last thing he saw before the figures closed in was the tall man standing behind the counter again, whispering to no one in particular, another satisfied customer. No one ever found Dan's car, and no one in the nearby towns remembered a diner ever being out on that road. But truckers still talk about it, how if you drive long enough through hollow pines during a storm, you might find it. A diner that shouldn't exist. A place where you don't order the food. Because you are the special.
Story number 3.
It was late October when Claire, a traveling food blogger, decided to detour off the interstate to check out a roadside diner she'd heard about through a comment on one of her posts. No name, no address, just coordinates and the message. If you want a meal you'll never forget, go here. Ask for the red plate. The road to the place was barely paved, winding through a dense patch of fog-choked woods. Eventually she found it. A squat, one-story building with no name, just a rusted open sign swinging in the cold wind. It looked abandoned from the outside. Still, curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed her camera and notebook and stepped in. Inside, the air was thick and warm, filled with the rich, savory smell of something slow-cooked. The diner was almost too perfect. Chrome fixtures, red leather booths, polished black and white tile floors. But there were no customers, no music. Just a man behind the counter in a spotless white shirt, standing unnaturally still. Claire offered a polite smile and took a seat. "Just coffee for now," she said, looking around. The man didn't move, didn't blink. Then he slowly turned, reached under the counter, and pulled out a small red ceramic plate. Claire frowned. "Actually, I didn't order." "You asked for the red plate," he said, voice dry and scratchy like dead leaves. "We don't get many who ask." He placed the red plate in front of her. On it was a small, perfectly arranged dish, a slice of meat, mashed root vegetables, and a dark, glistening reduction. It looked beautiful, like something from a Michelin star restaurant, not a backwoods diner. Despite the unease tightening in her chest, she took a bite. It was incredible. The flavor was rich, layered, otherworldly. The meat melted on her tongue, and the sauce had this deep, earthy sweetness she couldn't place. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The silence, the strange man, the isolation. All that existed was the meal. Then came the images. They didn't flash before her eyes, they bloomed behind them. A cold basement, chains on the wall, a man screaming into a gag, someone carving into flesh with a careful, practiced hand. Each bite brought another scene. A fire, a woman sobbing, a knife held at an odd angle. Her stomach churned, but the taste compelled her to continue. It was as if the food wouldn't let her stop. Claire dropped the fork and staggered to her feet. Her vision blurred, but she could still see the red plate, empty now. The man behind the counter was smiling. "You ate every bite?" he said softly. "What was that?" Claire gasped, her skin crawling, voice shaking. He tilted his head. "You want it unforgettable. Every red plate holds a memory, a soul, if you will. Someone else's story, seasoned and sealed. It lives in you now, and it'll never go away." She stumbled out of the diner, vomiting violently in the parking lot, then sped off down the foggy road. She never found it again, no matter how many times she retraced her path. She didn't even remember how she got back to the main highway, but the memories stayed. The scenes played behind her eyes every night. When she tried to eat anything else, she'd taste blood, bone, burnt hair. She stopped blogging, stopped leaving her apartment, and some nights when the hunger was too much, she would dream of the red plate. And in those dreams, she could swear she was the one making the meal.
Story number 4.
It was just after 2 a.m. when Marcus pulled into the Lantern Grill, a crumbling little diner in the middle of the desert. He hadn't seen another car or gas station for over an hour, and his fuel gauge was kissing empty. The sign above the diner buzzed and flickered like it was struggling to stay alive, but the lights inside were still on. He figured it was better than sleeping in the car. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, like it had been sealed off for years. The walls were a washed-out yellow, stained from decades of cigarette smoke. A jukebox in the corner played some warped country song on a loop, but no one else was inside. Just a single man behind the counter, wearing a cook's hat and an apron smeared with something dark. Marcus sat at the counter and glanced at the hand-scrawled menu taped to the wall. There were only 3 items: stew, pie, and whatever's fresh. He asked for the stew, mostly because it was the only thing that sounded edible. The cook didn't say a word, just turned, stirred something in a large pot, and ladled it into a bowl. The stew was thick and brown, steaming hot. It smelled off, not rotten, but wrong, like soil mixed with meat, like something buried. But Marcus was starving, and the moment he tasted it, something shifted. It was good, really good. But there was something else beneath the flavor, something he couldn't quite place. A bitterness that lingered too long. As he ate, he noticed the photos on the wall behind the counter, dozens of them. Each picture showed someone sitting at the very stool Marcus was on, holding up a bowl, smiling. Some looked recent, others were clearly decades old. But all of them had something in common. Even in photos, they looked empty, glossy, like the smiles were posed. Marcus turned to ask the cook about the pictures, but the man was gone. The jukebox warped to silence. The only sound left was a soft, wet dripping from somewhere behind the counter. Curious and uneasy, Marcus leaned over and peeked into the kitchen. What he saw made his skin tighten. A trapdoor in the floor was cracked open, and next to it was a butcher block table. Bloodstains soaked into the wood. Rusted meat hooks hung from chains bolted to the ceiling, and something was moving down below, something breathing slowly. Marcus backed away, but his foot hit something soft. He looked down. A worn duffel bag, half unzipped. Inside were clothes, a wallet, a driver's license. The photo on the license showed a young man sitting at the same counter, smiling, empty-eyed. Marcus ran to the door, but it didn't open. He pounded on the glass, but outside was pitch black. No road, no stars, just darkness pressing in like thick smoke. Behind him he heard a voice, not the cook's voice, but something deeper, older. A whisper from the trapdoor. "You've eaten the stew. Now the stew remembers you." The lights died. When the sun rose the next morning, the lantern grill looked completely abandoned. Boards over the windows, dust on the seats, no sign of life. A sheriff who drove past would later say it looked like no one had been there in years. But if you check the photos on the wall now, under the dust, behind the cracked glass, there's a new one. A man at the counter, bowl in hand, smiling wide. His eyes are empty too.